Hello, everyone. Before we get into the episode today, we just would like to take a moment to thank all of our patrons and our executive producer, Jeremy Marcoux. And if you would like to support us, you can do so by going to patreon.com/historiesmost, where you can either donate $1 every month, or if you want to be listed as an executive producer like Jeremy, you can choose $5 a month. So, again, thank you for all your continued support, and now, on with the show. Imagine yourself as a soldier. You and your compatriots have spent the past few years fighting in a civil war to prevent your country from becoming a fascist dictatorship. And unfortunately, your side has lost. Forced to flee from your homeland, you escape to a neighboring country, where you join that country's army to continue the fight against the tide of fascism sweeping across the continent. During the Second World War, this is what happened to a number of Spanish Republicans who, forced to leave Spain, ended up serving in the British Army. From the Pioneer Corps to the SOE to even the SAS. This is the true story of history's most forgotten fighters. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another very special episode of History's Most. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and today we're really excited to be joined by Séan Scullion. He is a Hispanist who, well, we could talk for a long time about the different things he's researched, but at the moment he is knee-deep in research about Spaniards serving in the British Army in the Second World War. So, Séan.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us, first of all.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here as well, Alex. Thank you.
Let's dive then straight in. This is a topic that, is right up the History's Most wheelhouse in terms of the kind of topics we cover. It's coming on the back of an episode on the International Brigades, which obviously was, we were talking to Richard Baxell about people from around the world, and in particular in his research, Brits who went to Spain to fight in the Civil War for the Spanish Republic. And this episode, I feel like, is really, it's great that it's coming after, because it's almost the inverse. We're talking today about Spaniards who often had served the Republic in the Spanish Civil War, then serving the British in the Second World War, which followed, obviously, hot on the heels of the Civil War in Spain. So can you give us, Séan, a bit of context? Because I think this, it's pretty new to me, so I'm guessing this is probably new to the vast majority of our listeners. How on earth did this come about in the first place? How were Spaniards serving in the British Army? Why did that come about?
Yes, well, I mean, there are a lot of things that align all of these things together, really. I think, first of all, it's a very unknown topic. People have talked quite a lot about the importance of the role of the Spaniards in the French armed forces in World War II, and there are some very good examples. But that's another line of research in itself. But I will have to touch on that a little bit to be able to give a bit of background. But really, the research I've done so far basically proves that there were several hundred Spaniards who were in the British Army in World War II in one role or another, and across the whole of the Western world, basically. So we're talking about Spaniards who fought in the beginning of the Second World War in France in 1940. We're talking about Spaniards involved in operations in the Middle East, Abyssinia, North Africa. And then as the war went along and they were able to get involved more actively in other elements of the British Army, we're talking about people who served in units that were more specialized, like the SAS and other units like that. but also in more generic roles like the Pioneer Corps and things like that. I mean, there are lots of areas I've not been able to cover so far in my research. There's lots of things that have still been not found, and that's mostly because of COVID at the moment. I'm just not able to get into the resources and visit the museums and the archives as much as I would like. But actually, so far, I've found a bit of a gold mine. The other thing, of course, is that, yes, people have talked about the stories of these Spaniards, but it's all been in isolation. And one of the ideas of my research is to try and bring the generic elements of this period of what is really ultimately British Army history, really, and try and give the Spaniards who were in the British Armed Forces, in particular the British Army, justice, and following the very well-trodden tradition of the British Army having people from outside of the British mainland. We talk about the British Army, but actually, we're talking about an army of the Empire at the time, obviously, but also you can't go without mentioning the Poles and other nationalities that had a huge influence on some of the operations during the Second World War. So the Spaniards actually did give their all in what they did, and did play a role, and I think that's really important to talk about. So that's kind of gives you a bit of context, really.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it is. You're right in that there is a kind of widespread knowledge, isn't there, about, say, the roles of Poles or Czechs, Free French, who kind of obviously had their own forces, but fighting alongside the British throughout the Second World War. But this story of Spaniards as a whole, as a group within the British Army, really, has not, received much in the way of popular attention. The thing that I think we want to address first, certainly that springs to mind first of all to me, is the actual kind of mechanics of it. So how, if you were one of these Spaniards, and I guess to some extent it's going to be different for each story, but how is it that Spaniards who usually flee Spain at the end of the Civil War come to serve with the British? How is it that they actually kind of make that leap?
Yeah, well, the journeys are extremely complicated in certain situations, very stressful, very dangerous, but really you're talking about the Spaniards joining the British Army in two generic waves, really. The first wave is at the beginning of the war, 1939, 1940, maybe even touching into 1941, and then the second wave is 1943, 1944. But you've got to start really with what happens at the end of the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War finishes, and you've got in the region of over 1 million Spanish people who have fled across the border. And by the time the Second World War breaks out, that has settled to a figure of around 500,000 in the camps and the concentration camps in the southern half of France. And out of that 500,000 who are in these camps, we're talking 250,000, if not slightly more, are ex-military. They've fought in the Republican Army, and basically they've been interned in specific camps. It's very well documented. A lot of the distress that the Spaniards had to go through at the end of the Spanish Civil War in southern France, and of course they were very heavily scarred by this. A lot of Spaniards felt that they were very badly treated by the French. But the largest groups of these camps were along the Mediterranean and the Pyrenees. And basically what you have is a series of laws that the French pass. Basically, from the summer of 1939 onwards, two key laws are passed, one in the May of 1939, another one in January 1940. And what they're looking really as is setting up a series of labour companies that are going to work within the French armed forces and support the French kind of war machine now that they're on a war footing. And really, what you're looking at is a series of companies that are set up, and around 200 of these are Spanish. So we're talking about tens of thousands of Spaniards who are being pressed into service, let's say, to fight for France as the Second World War breaks out. Now, you've got to kind of take a step back, of course. By that stage, quite a lot of Spaniards had returned to Spain, but actually the Spaniards that were left, they had basically three choices. Well, they had two choices, and then they had a third choice once the war broke out and France was invaded. They could either carry on being interned, which was only really going to be a short-term solution for the French. They were going to be returned to Spain, physically returned to Spain, and of course they knew that would mean them being interned and sent to concentration camps back in Spain, or they could sign up to what the French were offering. So you've got these 200 Spanish companies, and they're made up of what they call the CTE, which is the Compagnie de Travailleurs Étrangers, which is basically the foreign workers companies, or the PME, which is the Prestataires Militaires Étrangers, which is basically people who are pressed into service who are foreign. And these companies, by April 1940, we're talking about pretty much 100,000 ex-Republican soldiers being pressed into service. 50,000 or so are in the CTE or PME, like I said, those kind of companies, and 40,000 in the industry, and around 10,000 physically into the French army to be soldiers in the French Foreign Legion, or in some of the foreign French infantry battalions. And this is where you've got, with the outbreak of the Second World War, you've got a series of these régiments de marche, volontaires étrangers, RMVEs, and basically what they are is a series of infantry battalions that are pressed into service to help the French, especially in northern France, with the invasion of France by Germany. So what happens is you've got three key regiments there, the 21st, 22nd and 23rd regiments, and they're there fighting the fight. A lot of these people are able to withdraw down, and some of them are involved in some of the fighting at the latter end of June, before the 20th of June, when France fully collapses. But basically what we're looking at here is a series of units that are integrated. That some of these are the labor battalions, some of these are parts of infantry and things like that. And then you've also got the French Foreign Legion and the French Foreign Bataillon de Marche, or Régiment de Marche. And these tend to send these battalions overseas. And the two most famous ones are the 13e Demi-Brigade of the French Foreign Legion, the 13th Half Brigade of the French Foreign Legion. And they're really famous because they go to Narvik, and Narvik is obviously a fairly horrendous battle for the French. I'll talk about that in a minute. And they also then end up in North Africa later on in the Second World War, fighting as part of the 8th Army, and are integrated into that. But then also you've got a series of battalions that are sent to other parts of the world, and some of these battalions end up, for example, in Syria, and I'll cover that as well a bit later on when I go into a bit more of the detail of specific units. So the majority of the Spaniards are actually initially in the French army. They're not in the British army straight away, but obviously circumstances change. And a lot of these people were offered a contract that was either for 5 years or for the duration of the war. And that's what the Spanish signed up for. So what you have there is, as I said before, you've got the 13e Brigade, Demi-Brigade, and they go to Narvik, and basically they suffer fairly huge casualties in Narvik. And that brigade then gets whisked away early from Norway because of the invasion of France in May 1940. And an element of that brigade ends up in Britain, and an element has gone back to France to continue the fight, but actually ends up having to withdraw from France and goes back to Britain. And it's quite ironic that in or around 50% of that brigade was made up of Spaniards, and they took the brunt of the fighting in Norway. They really did, and they were surprisingly efficient, and the French were very surprised by how good they were. Well, they were that good because they'd been fighting in the Spanish Civil War. It's fairly, and they were the only people who knew how to fight against the new enemy, the Blitzkrieg and everything else. So actually, they were very brave, but unfortunately, they took quite a lot of casualties. This 11e Bataillon de Marche was the battalion that had a lot of Spaniards in, and that went to Syria. So, and as I say, I'll cover that a little bit later on. So you now end up in a situation where you've got May 1940, France is invaded. You've got all of these companies in the north and companies integrated into other parts of the French army. But also, you probably remember that in the autumn of 1939, my grandfather was one of them. The British Expeditionary Force was sent to support the French. And basically what happened was that they realized that they were in dire need of a large labor force to support the Expeditionary Force. And the French agreed to release a series of groupings of these PME or the working companies. And actually, the two groupings that they agreed would be either the Spaniards or the Italians, who were not prestataires but had been held inside similar camps to the Spanish in the south. And therefore, they were released and they were available from the late 1939. And actually, it turns out, from my research so far, 5 of these companies ended up supporting the British Expeditionary Force directly and were attached to the Pioneer Corps in various parts of France. So the north of France, but also in places like Normandy and Brittany. And a really good example of this is the 185th Labour Company, Spanish Labour Company, that was supporting the rear area of the British Expeditionary Force. And they were formed in the Gurs camp, which is a camp in the French Basque Country, just across the Pyrenees. And they ended up being sent to an area near Saint-Nazaire, where they ended up doing a lot of railway construction. And they were commanded by a Spaniard. Sorry, they were commanded by a British officer, but had a Spaniard who did the day-to-day. And ironically, this Spaniard fought in the Spanish Civil War. He was a Policarpov pilot, squadron leader, and therefore, he was able to kind of look after the group and everything else. And with this company came a lot of their families as well. Now, unfortunately, this company struggled quite a bit once the Germans got further down, and 16 were of this company of 250 were only able to get away to England. You've got a group from there. You've got also in the north of France, as I said, you have in the region of about 8,000 Spaniards supporting the French army. Some of them were supporting the BEF as well, and some of them are decimated, totally decimated. Some of them don't really get touched because the Maginot Line doesn't get touched that far over towards the east. But actually, you're talking about in the region of 75 to 80 labour companies or pioneer companies. Now, some of them were armed and some of them weren't. And there were 3 or 4 companies that ended up supporting the French defence of Dunkirk as Op Dynamo occurred. Now, the reality with that is that these companies were not actually the companies that were armed. So they weren't necessarily able to fight, which is obviously for the Spaniards, that was very, very frustrating. It also meant that they weren't all able to get away. So by the end of June 1940, we're looking at in the region of probably around 500 Spaniards who were able to get across the Channel after the capitulation of France. You've also got a series of people who are in Britain already, like the Spanish members of the 13th Half Brigade of the French Royal Legion. And you've also got a load of Spaniards in what's left of the French army, who are basically going to be given a big choice later on that summer. Do you swear allegiance to Vichy France, knowing full well that you're probably going to be deported, or do you go with the Free French? And I'll cover a little bit of that as we go through. So I think that gives you a bit of that sets the scene really for the beginning of the adventures of a lot of these individuals. I mean, there are literally individual stories of people who commandeered boats, literally in some cases rowed across the channel, and some of them were Spaniards. The 16 that got away from Saint-Nazaire, they only managed to get away because they were able to hail down a boat that was literally just sailing, that was full of poles, and they were able to jump on there. And of course, there was an utter confusion at the end of Dynamo. So actually, some of these Spaniards were forced to return to France. Not all of them, but some of them were forced to return to France. But I'll cover a little bit more detail on that in a bit. So hopefully that sets a bit of scene.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. And I think you've painted a very interesting picture there of, well, the kind of choices that these Spaniards had, these Republican veterans, in terms of, being interred by the French and having a pretty grim outlook in terms of either really at some point they're going to be returned to Franco's regime, in which case they're not going to have a very good time of it, or else serving for the French. And yet, as you kind of pointed out, I'm sure many of them would have interpreted it as a continuation of the struggle that they had been fighting already, a continuation of the anti-fascist war that they felt they had been serving in. And if they end up, obviously, having just come off of a defeat in their own nation's civil war, being involved in pretty disastrous campaigns in Norway and obviously France itself, in 1940, as we all know, the Nazis succeeded in the early stage of the war. So whether it be from evacuating from Narvik or Dunkirk, or as you say, some individuals making their way, we end up with 500 or so Spaniards reaching.
Roughly 500. They don't necessarily all sign up to the British Army, but you've got quite a lot of these who end up traveling to the Middle East and North Africa as well. So there's a large contingent of Spaniards who end up in Algeria and Tunisia, as I'm sure you're aware. And ironically, a lot of these Spaniards end up becoming the pieds noirs in the 1960s, 50s and 60s in the Algerian struggle for independence. So there are quite a few, let's say, European Spanish who are from Algerian descent, if that makes sense. It's probably not the right thing to say, but yeah. So it's all a real mix. And there's literally 20 or 30,000 Spaniards who end up in North Africa as well after the Spanish Civil War, who are of fighting age, let's say. So you've got these battalions that end up, these members of these French battalions that end up going to the Middle East and North Africa with the Free French. Well, not necessarily the Free French, but with the French initially. And then obviously these French have to make a decision if they're going to be Free French or if they're going to go with the Vichy regime. And of course, as you're probably aware, a lot of them decide to go with the Vichy regime. And in some cases, some of them are the Spaniards in these units are tipped off and are told, look, it's best if you try and get away, kind of thing. And this is actually what happens in Syria. And I'll cover that in a bit when I talk about the Middle Eastern Commandos and the story of the 60-odd Spaniards who made up a company of commandos in the British Army, which is quite interesting. And then obviously you've then got, and I said at the beginning, you've got there's two waves. You've got the beginning of the Second World War, and then you've got this 1943 kind of period. Well, 1943 stroke 44 is when a lot of these people's 5-year contracts came up. So a lot of them decided they were just going to walk across to the British side and become members of the British Army and carry on fighting. But also, the key one is Operation Torch in North Africa in 1943. And what you have there is you have a lot of the French interned personnel who are interned by the French in North Africa are released because they're in the labour battalions, labour companies, and all of that, like I mentioned before. And there's like a second wave of Spaniards who join the British Army as a consequence of that. And some of these end up becoming pioneers. Some of them even end up going through specialist training and become part of the SAS as well. And some of them just end up joining the 8th Army and going through Italy, which I'm still trying to find out a little bit more information about. But yeah, so that's quite important to talk about. So that's that second wave, and they just want to, as you say, continue the fight against fascism. And of course, there's still there's that huge question at the end of the Second World War as well, which is that there's these Spaniards who've given their all, and a lot of them have made the ultimate sacrifice. Let's be honest about it. A bit like the Polish, the Spanish really did take the fight to the enemy. This rather large letdown of Western nations, the Allies, letting down these Spaniards because they felt pretty much that Spain would be next. But we can talk about that a bit later on.
Okay, sure. I mean, we've therefore got this selection who come with the disastrous events of 1940, end up with the British, and then some, as North Africa is liberated, who had maybe been working or interred by the Vichy, coming over to the British as well. Mm-hmm. So once Spaniards, and again, it's probably going to be, very different depending on different stories, different circumstances, but once Spaniards basically made it known to the British authorities they wanted to serve with the British Army, what actually was done with them? What units were they put into? What did the British even think about this?
Well, a lot of the Spaniards were still called Reds by the British authorities. So there was a lot of caution. So the first example I can give you really is the Spaniards who joined the Pioneer Corps in Britain after the capitulation of France in the summer of 1940. So what we're talking about there is the number 1 Spanish company. Number 1 Spanish company was probably the best. It is the best example of service that the Spanish gave to the British Army during the Second World War. Now, and the reason why that is because it really has a varied and interesting story. And you would have thought that actually, as a company, it would have been something that would have been quite busy doing pioneer things. But when you look through the diaries of the company, actually, there's not much going on from its foundation until 1943. And when I first looked at that, I wondered why. And then a couple of years ago, Bernard O'Connor wrote a book called Blowing Up Iberia. And everything became very, very clear. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically, over 50% of that company was trained by the Special Operations Executive to carry out or to prepare for a guerrilla war behind enemy lines should Germany invade the Iberian Peninsula, which was actually pretty much something that was on the cards soon after Operation Sea Lion, which was the proposed invasion of Britain, was not possible because Hitler started to look elsewhere. And of course, the importance of Gibraltar was very key to Germany. And luckily, Germany never did invade the Iberian Peninsula, but the SOE had to do a lot of preparation. I'll cover that in a minute. But before I go through that, though, the nucleus of the number 1 Spanish company was made up from members of the 13th Half Brigade who were in Narvik. A lot of these individuals came back from Norway and were going to be embarked again to be sent either back to France or going to be sent elsewhere. And the Spaniards, a lot of the Spaniards in that Half Brigade realized that things weren't looking great for them. They really were a little bit concerned. And actually, a little anecdote, it's quite ironic that of the 1,000 or so French Foreign Legion that was stood in front of de Gaulle when he inspected the Free French Army in July-August 1940, nearly 50% of those Foreign Legion troops. I don't have the exact numbers, but there's lots of different quotes, but I'm going for a conservative estimate of around 50% of those troops were Spaniards. So again, that's quite a controversial thing to say. I think there's a lot of argument. There's been a lot of argument about the French reinventing their own history. Some would argue on the back of other people. I have no strong opinion on this. I'm trying to find out the facts, but the facts are that a large nucleus of the Free French Army at the beginning of 1940, in the middle of 1940, was made up of Spaniards. Now, a large group of these were not happy, and what they did was they carried out a protest. There was a big inspection in July 1940, and when they were told to stand to attention, all of these Spaniards decided to lay down their weapons and sit down on the floor, and they were all arrested by the French authorities. Obviously, the French authorities were only inside the regiments and battalions that were in Britain, so obviously it was the British authorities that had to kind of take control of the situation. And I have the Royal Pioneer accounts, and I just wanted to thank the Royal Pioneer Corps Association on this, because they've given me a lot of the accounts, the diaries as well. And the history of the Royal Pioneer Corps, written after the war in 1946, does talk about the French nearly deciding to shoot some of these Spaniards in order to make sure that they were carrying out their orders. And at that point, it's when the British properly stepped in and said, okay, enough's enough. And so they visited all the Spaniards who were in prison. They were imprisoned in Stafford Prison. And basically, by September 1940, all of those individuals were signed up into British service and joined the Pioneer Corps. And by that stage as well, the number 1 Spanish company was formed, and that was formed in Westward Ho that autumn. But interestingly, the company started to do some training and everything else, but actually that's when the SOE had started to look at this plan of how they were going to carry out the maximum amount of damage to the Germans should they invade the Iberian Peninsula. And Bernard O'Connor's book has got a lot of detail in it on their training, on the plans and everything else. But basically, the story with that is that the head of the H section, which was the Iberian Peninsula section by that stage, he called Crenell. He visited Westward Ho in December 1940 to recruit the first wave of Spaniards that were going to be trained by the SOE. And over the next year, you had a consecutive series of waves of about half a dozen groups that were trained by SOE. And they carried out everything. They did the same as the Commandos did in Scotland, and the other SOE did. They were trained in all the different centres, explosives, all the other different types of SOE type operations. For example, they were also trained in radio handling, and they also carried out parachute training at Ringway in Manchester. Ringway seems to be a bit of a theme, a thread through a lot of the Spaniards who were airborne trained as well. It's a big training centre at the time for parachute training. And this is where the story kind of becomes even more intriguing, because as these groups go through their training, the person who has written the training program and who reports on them is none other than Kim Philby. And Kim Philby writes these reports. They're all in the book that if you want to read in Bernard O'Connor's book. And of course, some of his reports were fairly vocal. You can already kind of read his very left-wing sympathies coming to the fore somewhat. So that's actually intriguing. And obviously, also at the same time, a lot of the operations in the Iberian Peninsula through the SOE and SIS were also being organised by Ian Fleming. So Ian Fleming had a lot also to do with the proposal of how they were going to use these Spaniards. And the Spaniards were all given the name sconces, SCONCES. And they were also going to be linked in with a group of British officers who are fluent Spanish speakers called relators. And these two groups were going to do a series of operations behind enemy lines. They're going to be inserted into Spain, across the Pyrenees, into the Basque Country, also from Galicia in the northwest, and potentially in the south as well, depending on how the situation developed after the invasion. And there you have the groups all going through their training. And the big frustration, of course, is that once they've done their training, what do they do? And they're kept under wraps because obviously they've all signed the Secrets Act, and the SOE has to keep them in barracks, and they have a few issues, obviously, with some of the individuals who aren't happy at being kind of imprisoned, really, in these SOE schools. A total of 140 Spaniards were trained by the SOE over the 2 years. So that's absolutely fascinating. And as I say, Bernard O'Connor's book gives you a lot of detail. But there's two other little stories that are really interesting as well, I find really interesting. The first one is, I talked about sconces and I talked about relator. And one of the 40 relator officers, in fact, it turned out they only managed to get hold of about 20 or British fluent Spanish speakers. And a lot of them were people who'd been in South America. But one of them was a man called Peter Kemp. And Peter Kemp, ironically, is an incredible story. One of my other lines of research that I've been looking at is actually the Britons who fought for Franco, and I know I've probably been picked with other people, but Peter Kemp was a Cambridge graduate who was studying for the bar, and in 1936 decided to join Franco's army to fight against communism because he felt very strongly about it. Turns out he was a bit of an adventurer as well, because after the Second World War, he basically became a mercenary, and he wrote a book called I can't remember the name of it now. It's Mine Were of Trouble or something like that.
Yes, that's right.
That talks about his adventures in the Spanish Civil War. So he joined the Requetés, and then he joined the Spanish Foreign Legion, and then there's the famous conversation he had with Franco at the end when he was given by Franco. You've got somebody who's got some extremely right-wing views, who is then taken on by SOE, who then becomes a relator, and as the plan changed of what they were going to do with all these sconces, one of the plans, as things developed, was for him to be like a team leader of up to 20 sconces. So it would have been absolutely fascinating if he'd have deployed with them. I mean, Peter Kemp actually did deploy to Spain, I believe, on a couple of occasions in the early 40s. But in the end, it was realised that it's probably a bad idea because they would probably cut his throat at some point or something like that. I've got no evidence of that, but it's clear that might have been the case.
That's sorry to cut in there, but that's incredible. I'm very familiar with Peter Kemp, and his book was for my own research about the Spanish Civil War, as really one of the few British volunteers who fought for Franco. I particularly remember an incident. I hope I'm not misremembering this, but I'm pretty sure in one bit of the book he executes an Irish international brigade.
Yeah, I mean it's not proven 100%, but yeah, it's pretty much taken the thread that he did execute an English speaker himself.
Yes.
So he wasn't afraid of, he wasn't afraid of getting stuck in.
It's incredible that these paths crossed of
I know, it's
these
amazing.
Spanish Republicans.
So yeah, I mean, so he ends up
with him.
actually, that when the program's binned, he ends up in the Balkans and he goes to support Tito's partisans. But as the situation develops and the invasion of the Iberian Peninsula is not on the cards, and again, there were lots of other things going on in the background. Britain was paying off Franco. It's been proven now that the government was paying Franco to try and stay out of the war as well. So there were lots of factors. But from the sconces, these Spaniards' point of view, it was very frustrating. They just wanted to go and fight and do their bits and get back to Spain. There are a couple of incidents that are really, another thing that's really interesting before I go into the last little story about the sconces and that is that there were two individuals that did go AWOL and did go to the Spanish embassy in London to try and sell their secrets. And that is, I did find that a little shocking, but I guess human nature comes in. They were desperate to probably go back to Spain and see their families, or they had debts or whatever. And as you probably know, the Duque de Alba was the ambassador at the time in Madrid, in London, and as a consequence, Franco's government was aware of these sconces, and that the SOE was training people to go to Spain should it be invaded. So yeah, that's also quite intriguing. That's and the book by Bernard O'Connor does go into a lot of detail. He's got the SIS reports on that, so it's factual. People are followed. It's known that these people went to the embassy. One of them was interviewed afterwards and ended up admitting to everything as well. They were imprisoned, but then they were released at the end of the Second World War. So that's that kind of goes slightly against the spirit of why the Spanish were doing that. But it's human nature. In my eyes, it's very understandable. People have fought for 3 years in the Spanish Civil War. They've been through a lot already. They see the opportunity to fight against Franco literally by being a sconce, and then they're put on hold for a bit, and they get frustrated, and then they get worried about maybe wanting to see the families and all that. So I think that's understandable. But the last story, which I think is quite fascinating, is in the end, out of these 140, around, and I still don't have a proper figure on it, but definitely 10 were used by the SOE for Normandy and other things, and potentially up to another dozen went into the SAS. But I don't have the facts and figures of those individuals. But I do have one, and his name is Esteban Molina. Now, Esteban Molina, he ended up returning to the number one Spanish company at the end of the Second War. But he ended up going behind enemy lines prior to D-Day and after D-Day to support the resistance and get them to raise hell behind the enemy lines. And he was a radio operator. His testimony basically says he didn't really know. He was dealing with code, so he didn't know what was being said, but he just basically was there to pass on. So he had a role. He had an important role. Now, he ended up coming back to England after that and settled down in England, married in England, everything else. And he is the father of Alfred Molina, the famous Hollywood actor. So one of my things is to try and touch base with Alfred Molina and see if he's willing to kind of give me a bit of patronage in my research. We'll see what happens. But I just think that's, again, another fascinating story. And these individuals are just coming out of the woodwork as we go through. So that's really the kind of number one Spanish company with SOE. The number one Spanish company then becomes like a proper pioneer company again, once the SOE have decided that it's not going to use all of them. And it carries on, it gets into its training, mostly with wood, dealing with forestry, so They're providing materials for bridges, for roads, for other things. So they do their training for that, and they deploy just after D-Day. They're in Normandy in August 1944, and they are providing that, essential support for the frontline troops, and they end up basically in the Ardennes by the end of the war. And there are a few little stories about, the Battle of the Bulge and shooting potential Germans and stuff like that, which is quite interesting as well. And the number one Spanish company then disbands in early 1946. So, that's absolutely fascinating for number one Spanish company. And then you've got the Labour pioneer, the Labour companies that were French, being freed in 1943 in North Africa, in Algeria, and in Tunisia. And out of that, the Pioneer Corps sets up basically 6 pioneer companies that are known to have had Spaniards in. And they range from the 337th to the 364th pioneer companies. And these pioneer companies were international pioneer companies, basically. But there were Spaniards in all of them. The 337th, for example, though, and the 338th were pretty much all Spaniards. And they provided support to the Allies in North Africa, and also some elements went forward into Sicily and some ended up in northern Italy by the end of World War II as well. Those who stayed in North Africa, they were given different roles. They ended up being in charge of prisoners of war. They ended up doing security of the railways and the ports, freeing up the fighting elements of the army to be able to go forward and fight in Sicily and Italy. And it's quite a good story with the, I think it's the 338th company. They ended up building a makeshift building for the Germans to live in when they signed the surrender in northern Italy. So a bit of divine justice there for the Spaniards. So I think it's quite a good little story. Now, out of some of those who were in those companies, you do have some people who end up fighting in the SOE and joining the SAS. And you've got a place called Philippeville in Algeria that became a special forces training center along with the Americans. And you've got 2 really good examples there. You've got one of a Spaniard who ended up in the SAS called Juan Torrens Abadia. Actually, he changed his name to John Coleman. And he's got a son who's still alive called Cliff Coleman. He's an artist from Glasgow. He lives in Galicia now, actually. And he ended up in one SAS and then in 2 SAS. And I'll talk about the SAS in a bit. And the second one is a guy called Sergeant Canovas. Sergeant Canovas' story is quite fascinating. He ends up doing special training in Philippeville. He gets some training in the UK as well. And he gets parachuted in 1944 into southern France, near the area of Foix, F-O-I-X, just north of the Pyrenees. It turns out that he's actually from that part of the world. It's a long story. His family was Spanish, but had moved there and then moved back to Spain. And then they had to leave Spain with the Spanish Civil War. So, and he gets interned and all that good stuff. And what happens is he gets parachuted in with some other SOE people. And of course, you've got this huge story, which is a second thing, another controversial element of French history, let's call it that, is the recognition of the Spaniards who fought for France and the role of the Marquis, for example, in France in the Second World War. And in many ways, you could pretty much draw a line across the bottom third of France and say that a large amount of Spaniards fought in the Marquis in those areas. And of course, the Pyrenees was going to be their stronghold. If you go further over towards the Mediterranean, they were there as well. So he links up with the Marquis, and he's instrumental in basically taking the town of Foix where the Spanish Maquis battalion, a small battalion of about 600 people, end up taking the town. And as a consequence of that, Sergeant Canovas gets the military medal for his bravery. So that's somebody who's in the Pioneer Corps, who then decides to go to do special training and wants to do his bit in the south of southern part of France. But because he's from that part of the world, it all makes sense. But actually, that's a fascinating story in itself. So basically, that's the Pioneer Corps, really. So there's still a lot there. I've still got a lot to do on understanding more about those companies in North Africa. There's a lot more to run on that one, and it's just tracking down the information.
And it seems like it is a real. I didn't realise how widespread in terms of the number of units that we're talking about involved.
Yeah, it gets bigger.
Yeah, I'm sure that there is so much. Kind of more to be uncovered. I thought a few things that stood out to me from the story of these pioneers and the different routes they ended up taking through the Second World War. It's always fascinating to me the way that SOE operates, or for listeners who are not aware, kind of British special intelligence operations during the war. In that they not only with the Spaniards that they're working with, but with the different resistance movements. You've mentioned the French, which was very, a large part of it, why the French communists or else Spaniards, as you say, in the southern France, it was actually, there is some talk about maybe even majority Spaniard in the French resistance. And then, you could go Italy, Yugoslavia, whatever. It's all kind of all the resistance movements are at the very least communist led. And it's fascinating how the SOE, because MI5, MI6 would have been very much keeping tabs on Reds before 1939. And it's very much a kind of, well, you could view it two ways, couldn't you? You could view it quite cynically and say, any of my enemy is my friend. And for the time being, at least, we're going to use these people. Or you could say that the Second World War is quite a unique episode in international history, and it's where anti-fascism is kind of
it seems to go against the labelling of the International Brigade members who all had kind of reports on them, didn't they? They all had documentation on them. It seems to go against that. But I think it's needs must. I think a lot of this is to do with needs must.
I also thought it was interesting. I don't know how much. I wanted to ask how much you know about this, because I have no idea. The backgrounds of the individuals who actually, the Spanish individuals I'm talking about here, who signed up with the British, in terms of, well, in particular, I was interested in their political background, because the majority of the Spanish Republican Army was conscript army. I think, it's something that I've talked about a lot as something that isn't recognized in the military history of the war in Spain, is that it's a conscript war, 9 times out of 10. So I don't know if you know much about it, but that came to my mind when you were talking about the people going to the embassy. Are some of these people who've just been swept along in a series of
I think there's an element
bad luck
of that.
for years?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. I think what there also is some of the reports that are written by the SOE and the SIS on these individuals. There are individual. You can get hold of their reports from the National Archives, and some for the SOE, for example. There is an element of. There is a little element of arrogance, I think, in some of the way that the British saw these individuals. I think, and I think that on the whole, unless you were fairly knowledgeable about left-wing politics in Europe at the time, you weren't necessarily going to be somebody who was going to be able to understand why the Spaniards did what they did. So there was always going to be that element. But I think there are two things. They come from a real mix of backgrounds. Majority, just like you, I think it's quite ironic. There's a lot of parallelisms here. Just like you've done in your book, when you talk about the background, a lot of the international brigades, a lot of them are working class, even more extreme than that in the Spanish case, of course. These are people who have come from a very low level of society. And and fighting the Spanish Civil War and in the Second World War, in some cases, gives them a sense of purpose. To be fair, I don't know if that's a fair way to describe it, but the British reports can be a little bit disparaging about their hot-headedness and their political views. But I think what comes through for me a lot in the research I've done so far is that there are two things really. The first thing is that a lot of these Spaniards were very proud of being in the British Army, which says a lot. There's a story of, for example, there's one in Dunkirk. There's a guy who was got away, and he joined the Spanish #1 company, and he said that an army that still tries its best to be organised and have good humour and have respect was something that he was more than happy to join. And I think he'd obviously been tarnished by his French. But I think also the fact that the British Army had a slightly different attitude towards people from other nations joining their army compared to the French. It's just a different way of doing business. The Spanish did feel as if they were very much more accepted, and I think that's quite key. And so it didn't really matter what their background was in that way. The majority who ended up deciding to stay in Britain afterwards became British citizens. They married into British families, or some of them even married other Spaniards in some cases. So actually, their background is important. It's very important, and their politicals are very important. Their political views are very important. But actually, it's not the be-all or end-all of the fact that they fought in the British Army, in my eyes. I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but
no, it is fascinating, because I think there is as well a certain trend as well with people, and this is not necessarily just in this time period, but of people who, for one reason or other, take up the military life, and then they kind of get into that way of life. And so the natural next step for them after Spain is to sign up when there's that French offer, and then the struggle continues. So they, when they've made their way to Britain, the natural thing to do is to keep fighting, I suppose, and keep serving.
I mean, there are, out of the few hundred Spaniards who revolted against the 13th Half Brigade, who sat down and laid their weapons down. They actually, some of them ended up saying, no, we don't want to join the army. And they ended up working in arms factories and settling in places like Birmingham. So, I think they all had something to give in that way, and their political views were important, their backgrounds were important. Some of them, I'll give you an example of a couple later, they actually ended up using their skills in what they were doing day to day anyway.
One thing as well that I've just remembered as well, based on what you were talking about in terms of the Free French and things. Again, it's not an area I'm an expert in personally, but it does seem to me, from what I've come across by researching in the field that I have researched in, is that when you're talking about a certain version of history, let's say, that the Free French, there's obviously, as you mentioned, a lot of Spaniards, and also Africans tends to be where they get a lot of the troops. So yes, I think you might be right, even though you don't really want to take a side.
It's a hot subject. It's a hot subject, and I don't want to go into it a little. I don't want to give a very strong view on it, because I want to be able to kind of take out the best bits that are going to be of use. But you still have to, understand that, in my eyes, the Spaniards had a very big role in helping the French army rebuild itself. The best example is La Nueve, the 9th Company in the second Armored Division under Leclerc. They were the troops that first arrived in Paris in August 1944. There is no doubt that that's happened. They were the ones who arrested the governor. The fact that he wouldn't surrender to them is another matter, but that doesn't matter. So, but but actually that company was decimated. By the time they got to Bavaria, I think there were only like 35 surviving members over 140 who started in Normandy. So, these are people who are fighting hard. They're really making effort, and they are helping France. The fact that France did not recognize the effort of over 100,000 Spaniards who supported the French war effort in World War II until 1975. I'm sorry, that says a lot.
Yes. And I believe, again, I don't want to put my foot in it here, and I'm not asking you to, but I think the reason that La Nueva, the 9th Company of the 2nd Armoured Division, was the one that was tasked with occupying central Paris was because the other infantry they had on hand was black, and they wanted Paris to be liberated by white Free French troops who were Spanish.
I don't know about that.
I think, again, I'm not going to put my neck on the line on that one, but I think I've heard that.
So
let's go back to let's go back to the Spanish serving in the British Army, and we've talked about the SOE, we've talked about those in the Pioneers, but you've mentioned several times that we're also going to go in this journey around. Really, it's a bit of a globe-trotting journey, isn't it? But we're also going to go to the Middle East.
Yeah. So the next one is 50 Middle Eastern Commando. So I mentioned earlier about the 11e Bataillon de Marche. So this is one of these battalions that sent the Spaniards. They volunteer to join the French Foreign Legion, or the French foreign troops. And one of these battalions is the 11th Marching Battalion that gets sent to Syria. When France capitulates, the French officers tell the Spaniards, look, I think it might be a good idea if you do a runner, because if the Germans end up taking us over, because the French were going on the side of Vichy in that area there, you don't really want to be here. Okay, so they then commandeer some trucks. 63 of them that we know of then get to go from Syria to the Palestinian border. Now I've got to thank two people here really with the information on this. The first one is a guy called Tony Fajardo. His father was a member of 50 Commando, and he was actually the first person I spoke to when it came to my research, after I'd spoken to Daniel Arasa, who is the person in Spain who wrote the first book on Spaniards in World War II. That was quite interesting. And I've also got to thank a guy called Phil Williams, who's helped me out quite a lot, especially with the SAS stuff, but I'll cover some of this stuff later. Basically, these 63 Spaniards are in a truck. They get to the border, and some, how would put it this way, an official, a frontier guard, a French frontier guard, gets in their way. And in the end, what ends up happening is the only way they're going to get through the frontier is that Joaquin Fajardo, who is Tony Fajardo's dad, jumps out the back of the truck, gets hold of his rifle, slams it into the shin of the frontier guard, keels over, they pull up the barrier, and they drive into Palestine. And that's the only way, really, they're going to get across. So they get across, and they basically go to the nearest army unit and say, "Look, we want to join you," kind of thing. And they don't really know what to do with them. I mean, we're talking August 1940 here that things are happening. So they get signed on initially into the Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey. And there's the Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey, and then there's a Sussex variant of that as well. And they're two areas that I'm still trying to find out more information about. In some cases, they are only literally on the books of the Queen's Royal Regiment, West Surrey, for a day. Because in August 1940, 50 Middle Eastern Commando is established with Lieutenant Colonel George Young, Royal Engineers, as its new commanding officer. And basically, all of those 60-odd Spaniards immediately become members of the commando unit, and they absorbed into one of the companies. In fact, they make up a company of that commando unit. And 50 Commando is the first of the Middle Eastern commandos, and you're probably aware commando units really were only formalized a few years later when they had all the training in Scotland and everything else. So the stuff that was going on in the Middle East was actually done slightly on an aside. They had a different training center and everything else. And the Middle Eastern commandos used, rather than a commando dagger, they used a thing called a fanny, which was a dagger with what looks like a knuckle duster as a handle. So they were very distinctive to other units, and they crack on with their training. And then basically what then happens is there are a series of aborted stroke, fairly successful operations where 50 Commando is involved. But then what happens then is that Bob Laycock sets up Lay Force, and 50 and 52 Commando. By then we've got 50, 51 and 52 Middle Eastern Commandos. 50 and 52 Middle Eastern Commandos are merged into the D Battalion of Lay Force. And by that stage, we're talking about commandos that are UK based coming out to the Middle East as well. And then what basically happens is eventually this battalion is it's decided that this battalion is going to go to Crete to help with the operations in Crete in the spring of 1941. And what happens with that, though, is they get to Crete, and the day they get to Crete is the day that the decision has been made to evacuate Crete. So that's not exactly a great way to start an operation, but the decision is made because these are good troops. They decide that they're actually going to fight the rearguard action to ensure the embarkation of Crete force. And that's the 27th of May, actually, 1941. So they start withdrawing from Suda Bay in the north, and they're trying to make their way down to Slovakia, which is on the southern coast. And they fight a series of rearguard actions. And this the Spanish company, the company that's made up mostly of Spaniards, is B Company of the battalion, and they've got Major McGibbon as their officer commanding. At one point on the 28th, the commanding officer realizes that he's going to have to leave one of his companies quite isolated, and he decides that's going to be B Company. So McGibbon has to go forward through the withdrawing. So he's got people withdrawing as they're coming towards him, and he's going forward with the companies, trying to convince the Spaniards, this isn't quite normal. Brits don't really run away, but we've got to go forward to this exposed ridge, and we're going to have to defend that against the Germans. And he's joined by some Maoris as well. And these Maoris have also commandeered some German machine guns, and later on actually carry out a bayonet charge against the Germans. Quite a ferocious bayonet charge. So the B Company takes the Germans basically full on. They're engaged in firefights of less than 100 yards in the scrub on this ridge, which is exposed. And unfortunately, quite a lot of the company is either killed or taken prisoner, and McGibbon is one of them. And the Germans, when they talk to him, they say that they were really impressed that such a small group could carry out such a good firefight. But of course, he didn't realise that they were all commandos, so he was quite chuffed about that. The remaining Spaniards who get away, some of the company do get away, and some of the Spaniards who were injured earlier also get away. They then end up in Slovakia, and sadly, not a lot of D battalion is able to get away on the 1st of June. Out of the 100 or so that get away, only about 15 or 16 are Spaniards, and there are some epic stories about some of the people who got away from Crete. The one I find amazing is they managed to get hold of some landing craft that were just left there. One of them ran out of fuel, so they improvised with a sail with his landing craft and managed to sail it with his improvised sail all the way to North Africa. I mean, stuff like that is just legendary. But there are, when George Young, the commanding officer, he's the one who has to end up taking the surrender or surrendering to the Germans in Slovakia. And obviously everybody's very disappointed. But George Young turns around to everyone and says, look, we're going to surrender. If you do want to escape, go into the hills, you can. And some of the Spaniards do. And I'll talk about the adventures of one of those in a minute. George Young is taken prisoner and ends up being very successful at trying to escape, and ends up in Colditz. And he is basically the leader of the escape committee in Colditz. He's part of the team that comes up with all those amazing plans to try and escape from Colditz. So that's quite ingenious. And I've just listened recently to his Imperial War Museum, National Archive interviews. He was interviewed back in the 60s. Absolutely amazing. But the story, and then the others who are taken prisoner are sent to Thessaloniki, and then they end up in Poland. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But actually, one of the Spaniards who gets away into the hills is a man who was later to be called Frank Williams, grandfather of Phil Williams, who's been helping me with this. And his surname is Jeronimo, and he ends up in the SAS later on. But actually, what happens is with Francisco Jeronimo, he hides in the hills, and he's in the hills for about a year, a bit less, and then an SOE operation comes and collects him. And as a consequence of that, he then gets back to Egypt. He's suffering from malaria. He's hospitalized. But then after that, because the Commandos were pretty much disbanded, and large elements of the Commandos were then put into the Long Range Desert Group and the Special Service Regiment, which then became 1 SAS, etc., etc. He ends up in the SAS. He ends up in 1 SAS and then 2 SAS. That's an amazing story. Those who were the Spaniards who were taken prisoner, 35 ended up being repatriated at the end of the war. 2 were killed in a Russian air raid or artillery attack on the prisoner of war camp, sadly, right at the end of the war, which is very sad. But there is a really interesting story, and this is another one where, we were talking earlier about Peter Kemp and how the Spanish Civil War kind of catches up with everyone. Well, this is another story which I found quite amazing. So Joaquin Fajardo, he makes some really good bonds of friendship with the British in the prisoner of war camp, but he's also very good friends with a couple of the other Spaniards. Sadly, one of them is one of the ones that was killed in the air raid / artillery attack. And there's a story which has been corroborated, and Joaquin Fajardo's son, Donny, he's told me all about it, and he has witnesses that prove it as well. And one of them is, when the story is that basically they're in Poland and they're on a works detail to go and do some work on the railway lines just outside a railway station. And Joaquin Fajardo is the only Spaniard in the group. The others are mostly British, but some other foreign prisoners of war as well. And suddenly, he runs off towards the train and starts picking up stones and throwing stones at the people whose heads are sticking out. They're in German uniforms. And he starts swearing them in Spanish and everything else. Turns out it's the División Azul. It's the Spaniards who fought for Franco in the German army on the Eastern Front.
So once again, we've got fascist volunteers crossing paths with these.
It's incredible. I just think it's amazing.
So amazing.
So I know exactly, and that's what really makes all what I'm doing absolutely brilliant. It makes it all worthwhile. Just little things like that. Quite emotional actually. So Joaquin Fajardo, he comes back at the end. He's one of the 35 who returns to the UK, and he marries locally and he settles in Southern Poland. Donny, his son, is in London, and he's been really, really helpful. Donny is probably the best person I found who understands the Middle Eastern Commandos. He's really, really made an effort. And one of the things I'm trying to track down is that there was actually a history of 50 Middle Eastern Commando written, but the archive being lost. We don't really know where it is at the moment. So that's one of my jobs, is to try and square that away. So we'll see what happens. But then what happens is, as I said, there's those 15 or so people who are able to get away, and they all end up, a lot of them end up in D Squadron of the Special Service Regiment, that then becomes obviously 1 SAS. But actually, I've also found recently a list of names of about a dozen Spanish names of people who were in the Long Range Desert Group as well. So there is an element of the Long Range Desert Group. There's a really good story as well of a series of raids that happened in Tobruk, Commandos in Tobruk, which sadly didn't go too well. But actually, the reality is that it was quite an audacious series of operations, and it would seem that there were some Spaniards involved in that as well. And so this was after Crete. So that's the story of 50 Middle Eastern commandos. So a bit sad, obviously, because pretty much 50% of them were imprisoned for the rest of the Second World War. But they had no regrets, that's for sure. And life in the prison of war camp, there's plenty of stories there as well. And a lot of these people ended up in Britain, so hidden away.
It's interesting that obviously at the end of the war they were repatriated to Britain rather than Spain as well. I guess partly because Spain was very much treated as a pariah state, non-country.
I think it was because they were British soldiers.
Right.
One story I didn't say was when they were imprisoned in Thessaloniki, and shortly after, they got really paranoid about their story of them actually being Republicans coming out. So I think it was New Zealand or an Australian doctor said, well, we'll just say you're Gibraltarian. So they were classed as Gibraltarians.
Right.
Classed as Gibraltarians, and Donny Fajardo has given me the paperwork, his father's paperwork, and he's classed as a Gibraltarian, so therefore he is. So that's why they were sent back to Britain.
Right. So of course, yes, it should have occurred to me that they would not have dared tell the Nazis that they were Spanish Republicans. After all, there was tens of thousands of them that were interred by France ended up in the Nazi concentration camps.
Yeah, Mauthausen, places like that, the steps of death and all that,
including the former Prime Minister of the Spanish Republic. He was in Mauthausen, Largo Caballero. But no, brilliant. So they just said they were Gibraltar. Easy.
Yeah. Well,
and then they could be British citizens.
At the end of the day, it saved them, I love that División Azul story. That really is for me. That really kind of brings the story alive. And this actually brings us, unless you have any questions, at the moment, any questions, I'll take us on to the Special Forces then. So I've said that I've recently found that there is a list of around a dozen people, Spaniards, who were in the Long Range Desert Force. I've really got to thank Phil Williams on this. His father, after he'd been in hospital with malaria after getting away from Crete, he became a member of the SAS, and his story and the story of a few of the others. This is where it really does get interesting. It really does get interesting. So at the moment, I've got 10 Spaniards I'm aware of who were in the SAS, and I know there are more. I know there are a lot. And the reason I say that is because you've got this amalgam of the Long Range Desert Group and the SAS going on, and then you've got the formalization of the SAS brigade in 1944 for D-Day and for all the latter part of the Second World War. And by that stage, that brigade was made up of 5 SAS regiments. 1 and 2 SAS were predominantly British. Actually, most of these Spaniards were in 1 or 2 SAS. It's ironic, but there you go. 3 and 4 SAS were French, and 5 SAS was Belgian. But they were all trained in Britain. They all wore British uniforms. They weren't wearing French or Belgian uniforms. So they were all intents and purposes, they were British, they were part of the British Army. Obviously that gave birth to the special forces and the parachute elements of the French army and the Belgian army. So I've been in touch with the French SAS Association. There is a French SAS Association. I didn't know that. And the lady who looks after the French SAS Association archives, her father was a major in 3 SAS. And quite funnily, he was secretary of the Royal British Legion in Paris for a long period of time. So that gives you an idea of actually the links between within the SAS fraternity are very, very strong still today. But actually there were lots of Spaniards across certainly 1 to 4 SAS. So I've got some names here. I've got Frank Williams, Francisco Jeronimo, which I've already mentioned about Crete and everything else. So he had the story. So his story is, of course, he went through the 11th Marching Battalion into 50 Middle Eastern Commando, then into the Special Service Regiment, and then into 1 SAS and then 2 SAS. And obviously he had the big Crete adventure as well. And then you've got 3 other individuals who you work with as well, Spaniards as well. You've got a guy called Justo Valerdi, who's Basque. And actually, one of the biggest sources I've had is from the Fighting Basques project. I've got to really thank Guillermo Tavernilla for this, because he's been really, really, really forward-leaning and really helped me. Justo Valerdi is the only Basque person that we know of that fought in the SAS in World War II, and the Basques are, very, very proud of that. And for the sake of kind of completeness, I've included him in that because the Basque Country is still geographically in Spain. You've also got a guy called Juan Torrents. Juan Torrents then changed his name to John Coleman. And then you've got a guy called Raphael Ramos. Now, Juan Torrents came from a slightly different background. He is one of those people that I mentioned before that had been in Algeria and then Pioneer Corps and then went Special Forces from there. And it would seem that Raphael Ramos was the same. Now, there's a couple of interesting stories about these individuals. One of these stories is when they were on leave. On leave. They were on leave, but then they went AWOL because they were 6 hours late or something. And that's Frank Williams. And it turns out that the only way they could get back to where they were, and I've spoken to Phil about this. We think it was in Egypt, as the SAS was being. Before the SAS, we actually think it was. When they were in 50 Commando, is they had to get back to camp, and the only way to get back to camp was to hire a horse. So they hired a horse and rode it. I don't know how many people jumped to the back of the horse, but that's a funny little story as well. But the one that's really quite interesting is the story of how they got their English names. So Frank Williams, Robert Bruce, John Coleman. And the story goes that they were in a bar somewhere, and what they did was that Phil has told me that this is something that he was explained as a child, and it was really so that they wouldn't get shot if they were captured. And really, when they were talking about it in this bar, a lot of the other people in the bar started to kind of, all right, so you want to do that, do you? You want to change your name? So they started to come up with some thoughts on names. So Juan Torrents, whose son Cliff Coleman, I mentioned before, he changed his name to John Coleman, and that's because he looked a bit like Ronald Coleman, who was an actor. Obviously, Juan is Spanish for John. And Ronald Coleman was quite famous because he'd been in Beau Geste, and obviously Juan Torrents had been a Legionnaire for a little while as well, and had decided that that would be the perfect name. And then the other three were asked, what do you think? And they went off and did a little kind of umflab in Spanish, as you do, lots of whispering and stuff. And it's possible that Phil's grandfather said he wanted to be Robert the Bruce, but actually he wanted to be Walter Raleigh or Francis Drake. Anyway, so lots of people started to laugh at that point, and basically he ended up changing that to Frank Williams. And Justo Valerdi obviously then decided to change his name as well, but he actually ended up taking Robert Bruce. And Raphael Ramos just didn't want to change his name, so he stayed as he was. And we'll come back to Raphael Ramos in a bit. He's actually quite an interesting. I think it's quite funny that Phil always tells me that he owes his existence to Hitler and Franco, and he owes his name, Phil Williams, to a group of drunken SAS soldiers from Spain. But there you go. So, quite an interesting one, that. So you've got the funny names kind of story there, but by the beginning, by the beginning of 1944, everything's formalized, and all of these people end up going back to Britain and do a lot of training in Scotland and other places. And they are used in D-Day, and elements are used also in Italy later on. And I'll talk about that in a bit. On D-Day, they tend to be doing stuff behind enemy lines. They're all parachuted in. Again, some of these people have done parachute training. Again, they're doing parachute training in Manchester in some cases, so ironic. And they end up being dropped behind enemy lines. And there are two well-known operations that they're involved in August 1944. One of them is called True Form 2, and the other one is called Dunhill. And basically, they're just causing chaos behind the enemy line, killing lots of Germans, blowing lots of things up, meeting up with the resistance, and doing lots of stuff like that. The stuff that the SAS were there for. But then in early 1945, the SAS is approached to provide some troops to do some operations in Italy, and that's where Op Tombola comes in. And Op Tombola is it's a pretty audacious operation, and this is where Frank, Robert Bruce, and Raphael Ramos come in. And obviously, I prefer to call Robert Bruce Valerdi. Sadly, Valerdi is killed. He's killed. He's in the back of a jeep. They've got big machine guns on the jeep, and they're basically just causing havoc in the jeep, and he gets killed. But actually, the attack of Tombola is a very audacious attack, because what they do is they carry out a coordinated attack with partisans and SOE, and they parachute in. And this is another funny one. They parachute in a Scottish piper who plays Scottish music in the background with his pipes. The reason why they do this is so that, and this guy volunteers for it, this piper, he volunteers to stand up and pipe whilst the attack's going on. And the reason why is they decide they're going to do that because they don't want any recrimination against the local population. They want it to be something that is done by the British, seen as being done by the British Army. We've got jocks coming in or whatever, and that's why it's done. And of course, the SAS troops are trained in such a way that they can multiply their ability, by causing havoc and everything else. And sadly, it's during this attack that Justo Valerdi is killed, Robert Bruce, and he's shot in the chest. And he's there's a bit of a story there. He ends up being buried 3 times. He's buried pretty much close to where he was killed. Then he's moved to another location. And then in the end, he gets moved to Milan, because we're talking about an area in the hills north of Milan where this is happening. and they carry out their attack against the 51st Mountain Corps headquarters. So it's there. It's being done for a really good reason. But overall, the operation is really successful. Raphael Ramos, on the other hand, he gets awarded. He's another person who gets awarded the military medal. One of the officers gets injured, and he and another guy literally carry this person for 4 days, evading capture and fighting their way back to the rest of the SAS team. And as a consequence of that, and I've read his citation, it's all inspiring us, citation. He ends up getting the medal. So that's the story of the SAS really, and there's a lot more. There's a lot more to follow on that. There will be loads more on those the long range desert group guys and potentially other people. I mean, I've got a guy called Alan Cooper, Angel Camarena. I've got Enrique Boganin, Henry Hall. I've got a guy who was called Revuelta, but he changed his name to Robert Shaw. And then we've got 2 Spaniards that I'm aware of in 3 and 4 SAS working with the French, Jose Garcia and Julio Cerrillos. So these are all names that are out there, and I've spoken to the SAS Association in France, and they're going to help me and all that. So I think there will be a lot more to come on that. And, fascinating stuff.
Even more kind of stories. Well,
and then there's only one more. There's only one more kind of area to cover.
Yeah,
I'll be good.
Yeah. Do you think there's ever been the case that because they've switched their names, they haven't been picked up as being?
Oh, yeah, I mean that's fairly straightforward. The only way you're going to find that out is by physically finding their files. And of course, places like North Africa, that's actually quite difficult. The record keeping in North Africa was nowhere near as good as it was elsewhere. So yeah, and it's the same, to be honest. One of the things I'm trying to do with some of the families who've given me their grandfather's father's details is, look, I will try my best to find out what your father did in the Spanish Civil War, and it's just as bad. Trying to find out the army records in the Spanish Civil War is pretty much impossible.
For the Republican
There are elements you can find out.
Very, very difficult.
But yeah, so yeah, I mean, you are right. The fact they changed their names, especially the Special Forces guys, yeah. And of course, there was always going to be that fear of capture, and I'm Spanish, I'm a Republican, I'm going to get sent to a concentration camp, or I'm going to get sent back to Spain to another concentration camp. So, there's always that fear. So hence why they changed their names. My last one is actually, they're 2 very sad stories, but it gives another angle. Now, you're probably aware, well, you will be aware, Alex, that 4,000 Basque refugee children were sent to Britain in 1937. Well, nearly 1,000 of them weren't claimed at the beginning of World War II, and they stayed, and some of them even ended up marrying some of the Spaniards who fought for the British Army. So
wow.
Ironic, really. And actually, what we're talking about here is 2 individuals who were both refugee children who were not claimed by their families, either because their families died or because there was no means of them finding out where and who they were. And these individuals were of the right, they were over 18 or 19 or 20 or 21 in some cases, and they were able to volunteer to join the British Army. And one of them is a Basque lad called Lucio Echevarria. Echevarria is a very strong Basque name, and he signed up for the British Army in 1942, and at the end of 1942, and he was actually a mechanic by trade. He trained to be a mechanic in England because he was based in the north of England, and he ended up joining the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers to start with. So he did that for a bit. And then he was transferred across to the Army Air Corps in the autumn of 1943. But he then volunteered to join Airborne forces. And he joined the 12th Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment, the 12th Yorkshire Battalion, which then became the 12th Parachute Battalion. And they were dropped into D-Day. So basically what happened was again, he attended parachute training in Ringway, Manchester, and on D-Day he was parachuted in along the rest of his battalion into Ronville, quite far inland from the coast, and they secured Ronville and fought off some attacks, and then managed to fight their way back towards the coast. But sadly, the battalion started to become quite decimated as they fought off counterattacks and everything else. And then they ended up carrying out a counterattack, which resulted in some very heavy casualties, including the commanding officer. He was killed. And Lucio was seriously injured on the 12th of June and died the following day. And he's buried in a Commonwealth War Grave cemetery in Normandy. So, that's quite a sad story, but, nonetheless, he in many ways didn't have the same background as the other Spaniards we talked about, but nonetheless felt the need to volunteer. And one which is quite kind of relevant to today, because this week is the commemoration of Arnhem, is a second Basque refugee child called Jose Maria Irala. Again, another very strong Basque surname. Jose Maria Irala, commonly known as Joe by the British Army guys he was with. He parachuted into Arnhem as well, just like Lucio did parachuting in, and he carried out the same kind of training. He was born in Bilbao, brought up in Getxo in the north of quite a northern part of the Basque Country, and then in 1937, again as a teenager, he got moved to Britain, and then he volunteered to join the army and joined in 1943, in April 1943, and he joined the Armoured Corps to start with, as you do. But then in March 1944, he volunteered to join Airborne forces. Now, his case, in my eyes, his story is very similar to Balerdi. He was young, he was keen, he was strong, he had a very strong sense of honor, and he was a very, very brave individual. He decided to join the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Battalion. So basically, they were the reconnaissance. The 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron. They were the reconnaissance squadron for the 1st Airborne Division. So they were at the forefront. They are what we now know in modern parlance as the Pathfinders. So he again carried out his parachute training in Ringway, and he was parachuted into Arnhem on the 17th of September 1944. And he was very close to his troop commander, who parachuted in pretty much together, and they became separated from the rest of the squadron because they were parachuted in, and then gliders came in with their vehicles because they had heavily upgunned jeeps to work from, very similar to what the SS were doing in northern Italy, like I said before, where Justo Balerdi was killed. So he and his troop commander were able to meet up, and they were able to catch their vehicle and then try and meet up with the rest of the squadron. They got a bit separated, but then in the end they joined up with them, and then they fought their way with the rest of the squadron and ended up in the Hartenstein Hotel, which was where the divisional headquarters was. And on the 20th of September, so basically today, it's the 20th of September today, a German self-propelled gun was spotted nearby, and the reconnaissance squadron was sent out to intercept this self-propelled gun. And in the course of doing that, Joe, as he was called, was caught by a machine gun bullet in the stomach, and he died a couple of days later on the 22nd of September. And again, he's buried in the largest cemetery near Arnhem, along with his one of his comrades in arms in the Oosterbeek cemetery. So another sad story, but again, worth telling. Really, really worth telling. And if it wasn't for Guillermo Tabernilla, I wouldn't know any of this. He's been and I would urge your listeners, if you have time and if they're interested in this, to follow up and go on to the Fighting Basques project website, because it's really interesting. And it turns out there were literally a couple of hundred Basques or hundreds of Basques who fought in the American army in World War II and things like that. So, the story is endless, and the more I do this, the more I find out all these little gems, and I'm trying to make those connections.
It's almost, it seems to me that it's one of those where the more you dig, just the more you will find.
Definitely. But yeah. I'm going to have to stop at some point.
Yes, that's always a difficulty with research, isn't it? You've got to at some point go, look, that's all I'm going to have to be able to find out.
So that's really it. I think. There are loose ends. There are the information on more of the Special Forces guys. There's more information I need to find out about the Queen's War regiments, Surrey and Sussex. I know there were individuals in those battalions that fought in the 7th Armoured Division and who ended up in Germany. Then I also know, obviously, there's a lot of work to still be done about the stuff that happened in Algeria and Tunisia as well. So there's a lot of loose ends there. I'm trying to tie those loose ends together. Only if any of the listeners have any information, of course, I'm more than happy. They can find me on Twitter, and we can go from there.
Yeah, it's worth giving Sean a follow on Twitter. He's at Sean F. Scullion, because you kind of tweet a lot of the discoveries you make, don't you? About
I do, yeah, and I try and time it with the time you have at the moment, kind of thing. D-Day Ireland, whatever it might be. June. I was doing 1940 and stuff like that. So yeah, I try my best. I think the next thing I'll be doing probably be with stuff with the SAS. I'll be doing a bit on that. At the moment, I'm just concentrating on trying to gather the information on the pioneers, really.
Yeah, it seems to me that these Spaniards, so many interesting stories. Like we've probably heard only a small sample, really, of the experiences of Spaniards with the British in the Second World War. So many. They've had the misfortune. One thing that strikes me, to be involved in some, military catastrophes. Not only obviously they've come out of the Spanish Civil War and survived, but then fall of France, Norway, Crete, Market Garden. They've really been at the sharp end of some of the whole 30s and 40s biggest and battles, and it's really, like I said, we're so grateful for you coming on, because you've once again brought a topic that I couldn't have told you almost anything at all about, and brought it with clearly, I think the passion and your knowledge and research about this has really, really shone through. So thanks an awful lot for talking to us, Sean.
Not a problem. I have a hashtag on Twitter as well. It's called #ContinuingTheFight, which is pretty much the working title of my research at the moment.
Yes, and we should mention as well that obviously that research that we've alluded to quite often in the episodes, you're hoping that once we've completed it, it'll become a book, which I will be
also presenting next year at the Society for Army Historical Research as well, in their centenary conference in April next year. So I'll be talking more about this, but obviously at the moment it's due to be online. I've been selected as one of the chosen few for that, so I'm looking forward to that. And the idea really is that this podcast and a few other things, hopefully, that will come off over the next few months, will start to kind of lay the foundations for people knowing more about this topic, and help me hopefully more in my research as well.
Absolutely. Well, as I've said, thanks so much to Sean. I hope our listeners have found that as fascinating as I did. I'm sure they did.
It really is an amazing story. It's something that you just never would even begin to imagine. It kind of reminded me of Well, like you say, just had that interview with Richard Baxell, and like you did say at the beginning of the episode about the amount of Spanish volunteers in the international brigades, reminded me of that a lot. Yeah, very, very fascinating. So thanks so much, Sean, for coming on.
No problems, Peter. No problems.
Well, again, a big thank you to Sean, and from us here at History's Most, I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex, and thanks for listening to History's Most.